crab, 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 crab. Fascinating.
I am having a dilemma. A first world problem, but a problem nonetheless. Does anybody remember that clip of Trey Parker and Matt Stone explaining to some NYU students about their method of storytelling?
What should happen between every beat that you've written down is either the word therefore or but, right? So what I'm saying is that you come up with an idea and it's like, okay, this happens, right? And then this happens. No, it should be this happens and therefore this happens. But this happens, therefore this happens. And
I'm going to invoke their advice here because it applies to my situation. I love Star Wars, but I'm living in the blasted hellscape that is the post-Disney takeover era. Long gone are the days of reading comic books and novels about the expanded universe. Long gone are the days of playing video games set in the Old Republic. Gone are the days of Darth Malgus, Revan, Master Satil Shan, Empress Asina, Ven Zalo, Valkorion, the Eternal Empire, Arkan, Thexan, and of course, Lana Beniko, the galaxy's greatest waifu. I'm getting sidetracked already, but I promise this is going somewhere. What we have now, thanks to Dave Filoni, Kathleen Kennedy, and the entire woke band of misfits, is a cold middle finger to the canon we once knew. In comparison to what used to be, Star Wars is now a jumbled mess of retcons, misunderstood concepts, and contrivance upon contrivance. Now, with no prior context, a small child might look at the new content and conclude that it's the greatest thing in the world. The colors are bright, the action is actiony, the good guys are good and the bad guys are bad. In a world without context, these blockbusters with astronomically large budgets are fun popcorn flicks. But it's when we look at them in a comparative way, we see that this IP is held together with toothpicks and Elmer's glue. It's this grand comparison that I want to explore in detail here. Except, I'm not going to harp on the movies and the television series that Disney has been churning out. I want to dive into Jedi Fallen Order. I'm going to invoke Trey Parker and Matt Stone one more time, but a little differently this time. I played Jedi Fallen Order, but I already love Dark Souls. But Mr. Rictus, I hear you complain, what in the name of Lord Gwyn's charred testicles does Star Wars have to do with the greatest video game series on Earth? Oh, my sweet summer child. Everything. You see, all that yapping I did in the introduction about comparison is going to come to light here. Small note before I begin, I'm going to let some of my own recorded gameplay just run in the background here while I talk. It's worth noting that I wasn't streaming or recording anything, but upon reaching the mid to late game, I decided to turn on OBS and just let it run. As I was starting to gather my thoughts about the game as a whole, I did manage to capture a few bugs that I thought were funny, so I'll point them out when I see them. I'll go ahead and mention now that I'm not here to talk about the plot or the characters. Suffice it to say that everything is fine, I guess. I don't know. Most of the storylines based on the Inquisition are not particularly exciting to me, and I really don't need to keep seeing different accounts of Order 66. Instead, I want to focus on gameplay. I'll get my thesis out of the way now before delving into the infinite number of asterisks and caveats. Jedi Fallen Order is a perfectly fine, serviceable video game that I cannot stand. I spent nearly every moment dreading what was to come next. And not the good kind of dread that you might get from a horror game. Every time I began one of those large-scale puzzle levels, every time I fought a new boss, every time I had to partake in light traversal to get from one end of the map to the other, I felt the need to. But
Why?
the game functions. It had an enormous budget, quality motion capture casting, a halfway decent combat system, lovely visuals, intriguing characters, that classic underdog trope of fighting against a much larger, more formidable, oppressive force. What's not to like about it? Well, it's not made by From Software. I'll posit to you that Jedi Fallen Order is a tried and true Souls-like. I'll even go a step further and say that it's more of a Souls-like than a lot of the games that fall under that label in the Steam store. Those 2D Metroidvania Souls-likes are way more Metroid and Vania than Souls. Cal Kestis is a nimble swordsman with an unlocked third-person camera swinging around him. He has the staple dodge roll, a parry mechanic incredibly similar to that of Sekiro. He has a healing system adjacent to that of the Estus Flask or the Crimson Tears. He drops his experience points at his point of death. The list goes on. So what makes it less good than a Souls game? Well, this is the part in every video game essay where we try to do the impossible by attempting to put into words how two different video game protagonists might feel different in your hands. The player character in a FromSoft game will not move even a nanometer without explicit, intentional input from the player. The only other time your avatar could possibly move is if he or she comes into contact with the collision box of a moving enemy. Exhibit A being the tails of Seath the Scaleless as he pivots in an attempt to face you, and Exhibit B being the godforsaken bed of chaos sweeping you into the void with her arm animations. Cal Kestis, on the other hand, seems to have just half a beat of latency between his movement and your pressing or releasing in a direction on your analog stick. This shouldn't be taken to mean that Cal moves slowly. In fact, he moves pleasantly quickly, but it seems as though he's weightless at times, like he's floating. In a Souls game, you're anchored to the ground with the weight of 1,000 neutron stars. And yes, I understand that this may have something to do with FromSoft not giving us a dedicated jump button until Sekiro and Elden Ring. Moving on to combat, Fallen Order is a very mixed bag. There's nothing that feels exceptionally great to me. At its best, the combat feels pretty visceral when Cal performs his scripted finishing moves, but there aren't a wide variety of them, so you'll get used to seeing Cal laterally roll himself over a stormtrooper back to back before performing an uppercut. Upon looking up a YouTube video of all the finishing moves, there are a total of 14 that he can use against human-class enemies. But 14 is a pretty small number, given how many hundreds, if not thousands, of humanoid-class enemies you fight. The only other time the combat feels this satisfying is when you begin to perfect parry blaster bolts back at enemies. Most other combat mechanics range from mid to downright atrocious. Cal fights large groups of enemies simultaneously, but is easily knocked out of his animations. Perfect parrying one enemy does not protect you from the asshole that's taking a swing at you from the side while you're mid-animation. I'd also like to compare the feel of Cal's combat proficiency to that of Starkiller from The Force Unleashed, particularly in terms of Force abilities. Starkiller's Force Push, Grapple, Lightning, and Force Pulse attacks make you feel godlike, almost overpowered. And these abilities put Cal's Force abilities to shame in comparison. Somehow, slowing enemies down for what feels like half a second doesn't feel quite as good as. The movement and traversal in Fallen Order is a different can of worms entirely. I can't fairly compare it to any From Software games, or for that matter, any of the Souls-likes that I've played. The jumping, climbing, shimmying, swimming, wall running, and free-falling are more akin to games like Assassin's Creed, Uncharted, and maybe Horizon Zero Dawn. The traversal is where I find Fallen Order to be sorely lacking in polish. An incredibly helpful and fine-tuned map in the style of Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal cannot save this game from the harsh criticism I have. The slide sections of a level are almost universally abysmal, and I sometimes found myself stuck in a loop of falling into a pitfall on the slide because I was repeatedly respawned in a disadvantageous position. I wasn't able to capture any of my own footage for this, so here's a perfect example from somebody else. The scripted cinematic events also left me with a sour taste, for similar reasons. Many times I was dropped into a cinematic freefall and experienced a seemingly mandatory death because I was nowhere near the interaction object to progress the scene. This problem I did manage to capture my own footage of. I couldn't find a good place in my script to thoroughly explore this next topic, so I'll just tack it on here and now. There is a complete lack of any kind of economy in this game. The most valuable resource you'll acquire is experience points towards a skill tree that feels half-baked in and of itself. There are Dark Souls-style treasure chests scattered around in your typical intuitive hiding places, but they really only contain cosmetics, different versions of feces-colored ponchos, pieces of your lightsaber hilt that you'll never be able to see during gameplay because your saber's moving around too much and the hilt is too small to see the finer details. And occasionally, you'll find a unique plant to add to a terrarium in your hub. That's it in terms of pickup economy. The last topic I want to camp out on is arguably one of the most important aspects of a Souls-like. The bosses. And there's nothing here. With the exception of maybe Trilla and the Malicos fellow from Dathomir, the boss lineup is just a huge pile of nothing. Unga Bunga, the skin elemental, Big Chungus, and a KX series droid are bosses only in name. They don't feel good. Their attacks feel cheap, they don't telegraph, and they don't matter. Try to think of the worst, most uninteresting, shittiest, most nothing boss in the whole of the FromSoft catalog. Yeah, that thing. That thing is what this game opens with. The first boss of what I'll generously say is maybe a dozen bosses in this game is that thing. I don't have much to say about these bosses, because they have nothing noteworthy to mention. I'm going to distract you and myself from talking about it by pointing out one of those bugs that I mentioned earlier. It is here, on this high horse, that I rest my case. This product is fine. But in a world where From Software exists, this product is not fine. This, I believe, is the folly of games as a medium collectively creating and recognizing an entirely new subgenre. The genre of Souls-likes is inherently a problem. Don't get me wrong, I adore Souls-likes, I'm one of those mythical creatures that believes The Surge and its sequel are criminally underrated games. But the problem with the birth of the Souls-like genre is a problem of comparison. I'll invoke Heisenberg's iconic analogy here.
So, it's grade school t-ball versus the New York Yankees. Yours is, I don't know, just some tepid, off-brand, generic cola. What I'm making is classic Coke.
The way I compare Disney Star Wars to George Lucas Star Wars and, Jesus Christ, Legends Star Wars is nearly identical to how I compare Souls-likes to original FromSoft IPs. Games like Ghost of Tsushima, Lies of P, The Surge, Neo, and of course Jedi Fallen Order are games that, in a vacuum, are 8 out of 10, 9 out of 10, and in some cases, 10 out of 10 games. But these titles will always exist in stark juxtaposition to the godlike status of the games that they draw inspiration from. Even the dumpster fire that is Scholar of the First Sin is leaps and bounds greater than most non-FromSoft Souls-likes. We have been spoiled. A huge thank you to everyone that stuck around to listen to the ramblings of a madman. Leave a like or comment and hit the subscribe button. I'm sure I'll make more of these in the future when inspiration strikes me again. Until then, may the flames guide thee.